Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Apologies for the eraser marks, my other pencil was just not being absorbed by the paper, so I'm going to have to switch to my good old manual pencil that tends to be able to write on any paper despite the fact that it's a little chunkier, so I have to be a little bit more cautious in terms of the space that it takes up. The chorale we're looking at today has two possible titles. We have Herr, willst, schicks mit mir, which translates to Lord, deal with me as you wish, or Wer in dem Schutz des Höchsten ist, which translates to who is in the protection of the highest. Very interesting chorale. I anticipate talking a lot about what's going on in this section right here, so I'm just going to hop right into the analysis. It's fairly straightforward otherwise. 3 sharps in the key signature. We start off with A major, we end with A major. I reckon the overall tonality of the chorale is A major, even though our first cadence is a half cadence in the key of F sharp minor. So after our tonic triad, we have B, B, D, and G sharp, which is G sharp diminished over B, that's 7/6, and then we have A major over C sharp, A, E, and A. That's our tonic triad in first inversion. 1-7-6-1, very common pattern in Bach's chorales. I do think this is where we modulate to the key of F sharp minor though, and 1-6 becomes our 3-6 chord. Then it turns into a progression that we see 3 used with pretty frequently, and that is to a 4 chord. D sharp, A, F sharp, and B, which is B7 over D sharp. This isn't a secondary dominant. This is 4-6-5. This is F sharp melodic minor here in the bass, which is a pretty dead giveaway that this isn't, 5 of 5 in the key of A major, but rather a 4 chord, a major subdominant in the key of F sharp minor. That takes us to E sharp, G sharp, C sharp, and B. Very common chord to come after 4-6-5. This is C sharp 7 over E sharp, or 5-6-5, and we would expect this to resolve to F sharp minor. Yeah, F sharp, A, C sharp, and A. Tonic triad, root position. True melodic minor here where it's ascending on the way up and descending on the way down. Sometimes it works out that way, sometimes it doesn't, but this is how the textbook will teach you how the melodic minor scale works, kind of to illustrate the point that it can use both sharps and naturals, but this is a common configuration, and there is truth to that. This is a very common configuration of how we often see the scale contextualized, but definitely not always. Passing 7th in the bass, D, G sharp, F sharp, and B. That's G sharp minor 7 flat 5, which is 2-6-5 in the key of F sharp minor. That F sharp is actually a chord tone. It's a neighboring 7th, so we don't need to mark it. And then we cadence on C sharp major, C sharp, G sharp, E sharp, and C sharp, which is our 5 chord in root position. Okay, moving to our next phrase, there is a bit of room for debate here. We do end with a perfect authentic cadence in the key of A, and I think that you could analyze the first 3 beats of this phrase in the key of A major, but we do have melodic minor in the alto here that leads us right back to F sharp, so that kind of converted my hearing back into hearing the beginning here as just a big F sharp minor idea that then leads into A major. So that's how I'm going to analyze it. We start off with something that kind of looks like F sharp major, but with the D in the melody it kind of takes away from that. F sharp, A, F sharp, and D, which is D major over F sharp. That's 6-6, which is very similar to a tonic triad, but not exactly, because the bass and the lower supporting voices look they look like an F sharp minor chord, but the D changes the function of the chord. Passing tone in the bass here before we get A, E, and C sharp. That's our 3 chord, a bit of transitive harmony here. Typically we expect 3 to go to 6, but here we see 6 going to 3. Totally fine. The same voice leading works 2 ways. C sharp is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. But then we have A, B, D sharp, and B. Kind of an interesting chord here. This is like a B7 chord over A, which is 4-4-2, and it's an incomplete 7 chord. We don't have a 5th in this chord, which is the most common tone to omit. by far. Sometimes we see the 5th omitted, but if we didn't have the 7th, if the 7th was omitted, it wouldn't be a 7 chord, and we don't typically see the root omitted because that's what we're looking for to guide what Roman numeral we put down. But we would expect this 4-4-2 chord to resolve to 7-6, and what's interesting is that, well, I guess it's not very interesting that it does, but it's just, I think it's so fascinating that with all the 4-2 chords that we've seen in Bach, they all resolve the way we would expect. Root down a 5th, and that chord is going to be in first inversion. So we have G sharp, we have B, we have E sharp, and we have B, which is in fact a 7-6 chord. And we would expect that to go to a tonic triad, F sharp minor, F sharp, C sharp, F sharp, and A. So this 6-3 progression here really sounds like 4 going to 1 in the key of A major, but saying a 2-chord modulation in this context just doesn't really feel super, it doesn't feel super genuine to me, just because the bass just really looks like F sharp minor for all intents and purposes for the first 4 beats of this phrase. It just, I guess I've listened to it so many times with that bias that it just sounds that way to me now. But all in all, you could analyze it in the key of A as well. It would totally be valid. But this F sharp minor chord, I do think is our gateway back to the key of A minor. It now becomes our 6th chord, passing 7th in the bass. We then have D, B, E, in G sharp. This is another, sorry, I made this wait, no, sorry, one second, my dyslexia just kicked in there. I wrote 4, I meant to write 6, and this is another 4-2 chord, 5-4-2, and we would expect this to resolve to 1-6, so pretty cool that it actually does that. We have C sharp, we have A, we have E, and we have A, which is a subdivided 1-6 chord. And as we're closing in on our cadence, we have D, we have A, we have F sharp, and we have B. That's B minor 7 over D, which is 2-6-5. B is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. E, G sharp, E, and B. That's a 5 chord, E major in root position, passing 7th in the alto, and then we cadence on A major, A, E, C sharp, and E. Sorry, A, which is our tonic triad in root position. Moving ahead to the B section, we then pivot back to the key of F sharp minor. This is a perfect authentic cadence in the key of F sharp minor, and I think we pretty much modulate straight away. We start off with another A major chord, A, C sharp, E, and A, so we don't need to reanalyze, but then we have a really cool common chord modulation here. We have A, D, F sharp, and B, which is B minor 7 over A, which is 2-4-2, and I think that's our gateway to the key of F sharp minor. It turns into 4-4-2, and we would expect that to resolve to 7-6, which it does. Lots of 4-2 chords in this chorale, and they all operate the way the textbook would tell you, and it's I mean, I gotta give credit to where the credit is due. You know, our foundations as, you know, people with a background in Western music theory start with the textbook, but a lot of times I think they step over the barrier of making these claims about things being more commonplace than they actually are. But I will give them credit for 4-2 chords because they really do resolve that way pretty much every time, at least in Bach's music, so it's very prevalent here. And I know that because Bach composed so many chorales, a lot of them make their way into the textbook for examples of what, you know, common practice period voice leading looks like with relatively early harmonic vocabularies. But 4-4-2 will resolve to 7-6, G sharp, B, E sharp, and D. In this case, it's E sharp fully diminished 7th over G sharp, which is 7-6-5, but still a 7-6 chord regardless. And then we have F sharp, we have A, we have F sharp, and we have D. Kind of harkening back to this progression here, even though there's like a gap in between the two chords, it's like we would expect it to resolve to a 1 chord, but it's not exactly a 1 chord. It's actually a 6-6 chord, which for all intents and purposes operates like a 1 chord, but it's slightly different because we don't get that complete resolution. It's like the voices are implying 1, but the melody is keeping us from really getting the resolution that we would expect, but we'll get it in a little bit. So after our subdivided 6 chord, we have E sharp, G sharp, G sharp, and C sharp. Also, we see two dominant chords, one beat after the other. This 6 is sort of functioning like a buffer between them. Bach often injects a buffer in between sequential dominant chords because they don't really, going from 7 to 5, it's not really a progression. It's more like continuing the idea of the dominant over 2 beats because the chords function the same and they're mostly the same tones, so it's not really a progression per se. But C sharp, G sharp, G sharp, and C sharp, sorry, this is an E sharp, that's 5-6, C sharp major over E sharp with a passing 7th in the melody. We then get F sharp minor, F sharp, A, C sharp, right? Yeah, C sharp and A. Tonic triad, passing 7th in the bass, passing tone in the tenor, and then we have D, F sharp, and B. That is, B minor over D, which is 4-6. B is a chord tone, A is a passing 7th, and then we get C sharp, F sharp, and G. It's very common for us to get a 4-3 suspension over the dominant, but by the time we get the resolution, we also get the 7th there. So this would be a C sharp 7 chord, C sharp, B, E sharp, and G sharp, which is C sharp 7 in root position. And then we cadence on F sharp minor, F sharp, A, C sharp, and F sharp, tonic triad, root position. And now we've made it to the dreaded penultimate phrase. Honestly, there are so many different ways that you could go about analyzing this phrase. It's pretty astounding. There's a lot of harmonic activity happening over the span of however many beats this is. It's not a very long phrase. It's only like 2+ measures long. And if you look at the bass line, let's just take a second to look at the bass line here. We start with B sharp to C sharp. That's just sort of tonicizing C sharp here. And I do think the phrase does start in the key of C sharp minor, even if it's just for 2 beats, because this phrase is so odd. But then we have C sharp going down to B, going down to A. That sounds undoubtedly just completely like A major because of what we have happening on the passing chord. It just looks like we're tonicizing A on the next beat. And then after we tonicize A, or we're not really tonicizing A per se, it just sounds like A major after the fact because the bass is outlining an A major scale and the chords happen to be sort of implying an A major feel. But then we have a B, we have a bass line that not only briefly tonicizes E major, but then pivots to B minor and then outlines D major. There's a lot of harmonic activity going on here, and I don't know exactly how granular I need to be about where we've changed key or if it's just a series of tonicizations. But to me, as a formality, I think the phrase starts in the key of C sharp minor, because if I was to make the argument that this whole phrase was in A major until we got to the cadence, and just to spoil what I think the cadence is, I think it's a plagal cadence in the key of D major, but I think it's ultimately sort of functioning as a subdominant cadence, which is a term I haven't used in a long time. But this D major chord comes out of nowhere, and it does not sound like this phrase wants to end in the key of D major. It sounds like it wants to end in the key of A major, but Bach pivots with these G naturals here and changes the context of the cadence from A major to D major, but not exactly, because I do think he moves to B minor very briefly to introduce D major. We'll talk about it. So I think we start in C sharp minor only because of the fact that after this break, the first chord we hear is G sharp major, B sharp, G sharp, D sharp, and G sharp, which is 5-6 in the key of C sharp minor. There's nothing inherently A major-like about G sharp major. It would be a secondary dominant, and I don't think saying that we start off in a key with a secondary dominant is... I don't want to say it's I want to avoid using terms like valid, because I think you could make that argument. Like if your reasoning is that, well, I know that we're going to the key of A major and this just happens to be the point that starts the context, that's understandable. But for me, I tend to be more of like a momentary, my analysis is more like moment to moment, in the sense that we don't know that we're moving to the key of A major yet. So until that happens, we're analyzing locally to the beat. In most cases. Sometimes it's difficult to do that. In most cases, I stick to that, and that's how I analyze, and that's the thought process that goes into it. But stylistically, if you want to look at the whole phrase and say this analysis is going to assume that the phrase is mostly in A major, that's totally valid too. I totally see where you're coming from. But like if you're a student and you're working on an assignment and the professor or the teacher, they give you a context in which they're looking for a correct answer, right? They're trying to see if you can demonstrate your knowledge of being able to discern what exactly is happening here, and it's less about critical thinking and more about your knowledge of the subject. You'd want to go with what they tend to go towards because they're grading the assignment, right? So there's some strategy there, but here this isn't an assignment for me. I'm doing this for my own research, so my analysis is going to reflect that. So C sharp, kind of a light C sharp here, but we move to a C sharp chord, C sharp, G sharp, E, and E, which is our tonic triad in the key of in the key of C sharp. Sorry, I got tongue tied there. And I do think this is where we go back to the key of A. So as you can see, very brief modulation, and it's just a demonstration of the fact that I don't think G sharp major is really implying A major. That's the only thing that I'm implying here. Kind of the same, for me, it's kind of going against what I did here at the beginning, where if we hear D major at the beginning of the phrase, I said that this could have been a 2-beat A major phrase, but the main difference between the beginning of the chorale and towards the end of the chorale is that D major is also diatonic to the key of F sharp minor, so it lended itself to a more elegant analysis. But here it really does feel like we have C sharp sort of leading into A major. And what ends up happening is we have D natural here, which is like the flat 2 in C sharp. So we immediately pivot away from C sharp minor to E, B, D, and G sharp. I don't know why I spelled it in that order, but in a lot of contexts where we see 3, we often see it go to a 5-4-3 chord, and I don't know why that's particularly the case. Maybe it has to do with the voice leading and this B being the 5th of a 5 chord, but we see 5-4-3 fairly frequently. This isn't the first time that I've pointed this out, but in the context of where we see 3 chords, 3 going to 5-4-3 is one of the more common contexts in which we see them. So afterwards we would expect that to go to A major, which it does. D, and E. D is a 4-3 suspension over the bass, but this C sharp is the 3rd of our A major chord, and here is where you can get pretty granular. If you feel like this phrase is a series of modulations that are just like short 2-beat tonicizations of a chord, like C sharp going to A, and then we go to E, and then we go to B, and then we go to D. I think that's a very valid analysis, but I think actually we don't ever visit the key of E major. I think we tonicize E major, but I think E major actually ends up being our gateway to B minor, where one of the cheeky things that Bach does is he uses the melodic minor scale to take chords that are otherwise far apart or distant key centers and make them seem a little bit more relative, like E major and B minor, which would otherwise be further apart on the circle of fifths, right? They're not adjacent to one another, so they're not keys that you would likely see linked together back to back. So we start off with A, F sharp, D sharp, and B, which is B7 over A, and I think that's 5-4-2 of 5, B7 being the dominant 7 chord of E major, and we would expect this to resolve to 5-6, right, because it's a 4-2 chord. We have G sharp, we have E, and we'll get to this G natural in a second, but we have G sharp, E, and B, which is 5-6. So it resolves the way that we would expect, and this is where my analysis, I feel, is quite possibly the weakest in terms of the overall strength of how I interpret this phrase. I think really what's going on here, the big picture, is that Bach is taking leading tones and then reversing them, or in this case, taking a tone and then re-adding the accidental, or not necessarily re-adding the accidental because the accidental wasn't there in the first place, but using a pivot tone and then adding an accidental or removing an accidental after the fact. So here we have B sharp and then B natural. Here we have A natural and A sharp, and changing that context over a short tone, in this case, I feel puts the modulation on the and of the beat. So I do think really what's happening here is a short phrase, or a very short fragment. I don't want to call it a whole phrase because this entire 2+ measure excerpt of the chorale is a phrase. This is a fragment. I think this E major chord is now 4/6 in the key of B minor. And the fact that it's happening on the and of the beat is, I don't want to say problematic, but it's something that I tend to avoid doing in my analysis unless there's cause to do so. And in this case, I do think there's cause, just because of the fact that the phrase turns very quickly with very little notice to melodic minor in terms of B. So G sharp, A sharp, B. So this 4/6, and it actually operates the way we would expect. A sharp, G, E, and C sharp. It's A sharp 7. A sharp diminished 7, fully diminished 7, 4 going to a 7 chord, that then leads us to 1, B, F sharp, D, and D. Tonic triad, root position. So there is this, I don't want to say tonal, well, maybe it is tonal ambiguity. Are we still in the key of A major by this point and we're just tonicizing B minor, or have we moved to the key of B minor? To me, it sounds like we're in the key of B minor by the time we get to this B minor chord, and everything is just moving very quickly. He's just going through the motions of moving from A major, potentially to E major, and then to B minor. I don't know if he's moving to the key of E major exactly, but it definitely feels like E major gets some treatment here, maybe a little bit more than a tonicization. But all in all, there's some movement to E from A, there's some movement from C sharp to A. Whether we move to C sharp as a direct modulation here, I feel like that's fairly nebulous or minute. Really, this whole phrase could be an A major and then go to B minor, but like I said, when I see G sharp major, I don't think A major, so really it feels like C sharp minor for the very beginning of the phrase. But yeah, lots of harmonic movement in this phrase, and this is how I justify it. The only, I feel like, weak link in this analysis being that the modulation's happening on the and of the beat, which, you know, it's justifiable in the sense that really the and of this beat starts the B minor chain. This is a subdivided chord progression, so really the and of the beat is treated almost as equally as the non-and of the beat, the numbered beat itself. So anywho, this is where we then move to D major. So we would expect a cadence in maybe A major after this, where B would be our 2, but actually we cadence on D major. This B minor chord becoming our 6th chord in my opinion. C is a passing tone, F sharp and D. We sort of just get a flip of what the inner voices are doing here before we get B, D, G, and B. It's a 4 chord in first inversion, 4/6, 6 going to 4. A progression we've been seeing a lot more recently, so I think I'm going to stop commenting on it as much, just because it's kind of interesting that they go from one to the other. 4/6 is kind of like a 6 chord in the first place because they have the same root and they're mostly consisting of the same tones, so I feel like really this is just a big 4 chord or a big 6 chord, one or the other. But something to note about 4/6 chords is that when they go to a tonic triad, like we do in this case, D, D, F sharp, and A, this G being a 4/3 suspension over the bass, when we have 4/6 going to 1 in this ascending configuration, we always have the leading tone connecting the 6 and the 1 of the chord. That's been consistent across all of the chorales, just like the 4/2 chords, resolving the way that they do. Another little tidbit that I've taken note of: we never see 4/6 just skip up to 1. It's always stepwise motion. Sometimes and actually a lot of the time we get a subdivided 7 chord here, but this is really the root oh, maybe I should not use the word root because that means something, but this is the foundation, the bare minimum that we see a 4-to-1 progression in this ascending configuration start. A lot of the time we get 4 going to 7, where this C sharp becomes the root of the 7 chord, but here, this is where it starts, the stepwise motion in the bass. So yeah, the reason why I called this a sub-dominant cadence is because in the grand scheme of the chorale, it feels like A is the overall tonality of this phrase, and then D sneaks up on us. We would expect G sharps throughout this phrase, but when Bach introduces the G natural again here, in front of this D chord, it doesn't really feel like it is a counterpart to B minor. It feels more so like a counterpart to A to me, and D is the subdominant of A, which brings into question whether or not we've actually modulated to the key of B minor. To me, I think we have, just because it sounds that way to me. This melodic minor fragment in the bass is pretty undeniable in my opinion, but all in all, it's fairly nebulous. I think the overall resounding tonality of this phrase is A major, which is why D major feels like a subdominant cadence to me. And you might be wondering what I mean by subdominant cadence. What I mean is that instead of, well, for starters, we cadence on the 4 of the scale, and there really isn't terminology that we have to articulate when we cadence on anything other than 1, 5, or I guess 6, like a deceptive cadence. You could make arguments that cadencing on 4 is sort of like a deceptive cadence, but the way that Bach approaches it doesn't really look like a deceptive cadence. It looks like a plagal cadence in the key of D major. It just feels very, it sticks out of the texture a lot. It feels like the melody here is like a descending A major scale, but he forces a D major perspective on it, and when those two worlds clash, it feels like a subdominant cadence. It feels like we're cadencing on the 4 of A, even though we have modulated to D, which is why I've been calling them subdominant cadences. But it's been a while since they've been super common. They used to be very, very common a couple months back. Like pretty much every chorale had one, or maybe 1 out of every 3 chorales had at least one subdominant cadence. But all in all, it's very fascinating that they're still coming up later into this collection. But we are eventually going to move back to the key of A major. I'm going to make the argument that this D is actually the 4 in the key of A major, following that subdominant cadence narrative. It is the subdominant of 4, and as we can see, we don't have any chromaticism. This G sharp is just to reverse the G natural that we had in the previous phrase. It's just a courtesy. But we end with a perfect authentic cadence in the key of A major, and this phrase is fairly straightforward. We have G sharp, E, B, and E, which is E major over G sharp, that's 5/6. We then have A, E, B, and C sharp. This B is a 9/8 suspension over the bass, and by the time the resolution happens, we get C sharp in the bass, so I'm going to call this a 1/6 chord, A major over C sharp. A little neighboring 7th here before we get F sharp, C sharp, A, and C sharp, which is our 6th chord, F sharp minor, passing 7th in the bass, passing tones, one of them being a passing 7th in the tenor as well, and then we have D, F sharp, A, and B, which is B minor 7 over D, that's 2/6/5, 6 going to 2/6/5, very normative progression. G sharp is a passing tone, F sharp is a chord tone, E is a non-chord tone, and we would expect this to go to some type of 5 chord, which actually, technically speaking, it does on the and of this beat, because otherwise we have 2 going to 1, which is a relatively uncommon progression. Usually there's some grain of salt when we see 2 go to 1, which is what happens on this beat here, C sharp, A, E, and A, 1/6. But on the and of this beat, if we take E, G sharp, B, and D, we have 5/4/2, which coincidentally resolves to 1/6, or at least it is supposed to resolve to 1/6, because typically 4/2 chords, like I've mentioned earlier, resolve usually down a 5th, so the root 5/1, and then the chord will be in first inversion. Let me also mention the fact that this D is sort of like a lower suspension. Maybe it's like a, what would it be, like a 9/10 suspension underneath the alto perhaps, or a 11/12, wait, what would that be? D up to A, like a 12/13, what would that be? 12, 13, a 5, 6 suspension, probably a 9, 10 suspension underneath the alto. That makes more sense. After our 1, 6 chord, we have B, D, E, and G sharp. That is 5, 4, 3, E7 over B. We've seen another 5, 4, 3 chord earlier in the chorale. And E and B here, they're both chord tones, and they briefly take the chord and put it in root position and remove the 7th, so I'll change the figured bass for that. And that takes us to 1, C sharp, A, E, and A. That's first inversion. This A is also a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. And as we're closing in on the end of our chorale, we have E, A, E, and B. This A being a 4-3 suspension over the bass. We're still implying a 5 chord. The resolution happens on the next beat, E, G sharp, E, and B. A little delayed passing 7th here in the alto as well before we cadence on A major. A, E, C sharp, and A. Tonic triad, root position. And that is today's analysis. All in all, I think the big takeaways from this chorale are the mid-phrase modulations. So we start off with a mid-phrase modulation, we have another mid-phrase modulation, and this phrase has definitely some mid-phrase modulations going on, but how many keys we visit is largely up to the way that you analyze the chorale, but he definitely visits a bunch of different keys in this particular phrase. It's a topsy-turvy, kind of a drunk phrase in the sense that it doesn't really know. It's having a hard time deciding, what it wants to be. It doesn't have a clear sort of train of thought. Really the last phrase being the only real, or I guess the first phrase of the B section as well spends the majority of its time in F sharp minor. But yes, we see some mid-phrase modulations throughout the chorale, and also just the overall tonal ambiguity of what's going on here. I do think that it is ambiguous. We don't know exactly whether we stay in the key of A or move to B minor, or if we move to D major, or if we start in C sharp minor. There's a lot going on, and I think it has to do with just the nullification or the adding of accidentals around these pivot tones here. C sharp with B sharp and B natural on the either side of it, or A and A sharp on the other side of this G sharp here, so that contributes to the ambiguity. But other than that, that's pretty much all I wanted to mention about today's chorale. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel, hit the notification icon, and like the video if you enjoyed the content. Thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.